This Civic Media podcast is sponsored by UW Organ and Tissue Donation. Organ donations are desperately needed, and now is the right time to become an organ donor. Talk to your family. Get the dot. Save lives. Go to heroicdeed.com.
Trying to rain on the thunder. Tell a storm I'm new. I'm a walk, I'm a march on the regular. Painted white, black, blue. Love, forgive me, I've been running blind in truth. I'm a rain on this bitter love. Tell the sweet I'm new. I'm telling these tears go and fall away, fall away. May the last one burn into flames. Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Yeah. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too. I break chains all by myself. Won't let my freedom.
All right. Welcome to the Maggie Daun Show. Yeah, I got it. I got it. Yes, not quite Maggie Daun, but it is Earl Ingram. And good afternoon to you, Brother Carter. How you doing, man?
Man, I am feeling good. It's good to have you on the show today, man. Guest hosting for Maggie today, man. Thank you.
It's good to finally be able to connect with you, brother.
Hey, for sure. Likewise, man.
You know, there's so much that I want to talk about, and welcome to the audience of Maggie Daun. I'm honored and privileged to have this opportunity, and especially in a day and a time like this. I am going to spend this entire show talking about the life and legacy of a man that I not only admired, but a man who lived his life in a manner that very few did. I'm talking about the one and only Jimmy Carter. Really, James Earl Carter Jr., the former president of the United States. I'm a man who was blessed enough to have lived my life at the time that Jimmy Carter was moving on this earth. And the things that he accomplished, we're going to go through some aspects of this man's life that will astound you. Because he was such a humble man, a servant, a man who dedicated his life to service. Look, I'm a servant myself. And so I admire what this man did and the impact that he had on so many people's lives. You know, people talk about I'm a Christian, and they profess it from their mouths, but very few do that in actions. Jimmy Earl Carter Jr. did just that. He was married to his childhood sweetheart, Rosalind Carter, for 78 years. Did you hear that? 78 years committed to his wife. And we're going to go through a whole lot of history about this man. I don't think there's anything more that I wanted to discuss during Maggie's show than to tell you about the impact that he had on my life. You know, not what I read in a book, but what I saw. And the fact that he was given the longevity of life, 100 years. 100 years. He was rewarded for a job well done. Now, there are people who say some horrific things about Jimmy Carter. But those people who say horrific things about Jimmy Carter didn't know anything at all about him. And after we're done today, I hope that those of you who haven't known much about him other than he was the former president of the United States and a man who, after his presidency in 4 years, dedicated the remainder of his life, him and his wife, to serving all over the world. People who are considered nondescript. He never saw a nondescript person in his life. You know who he patterned his life after? You know, Jesus. He actually tried to live his life predicated on what Christ would have us do. Now, you may not be a Christian in this audience, and, you know, but those who are know what the definition of a Christian is. It's one who's willing to submit his will to do the will of, you know, Christ. And so that's who Jimmy Carter was. So we're going to go, you know, down this journey for the next 2 hours. And I hope that you get something out of this man who was blessed, but more than anything else, he blessed others and was able to, even in the face. Here's a man who some people said, well, he was a peanut farmer. Yeah, he was clearly that. But he was much more than a peanut farmer. When I run down the accomplishments of Jimmy Carter, you will be absolutely amazed. Here's 10 little-known facts about former President Jimmy Carter. Peanut farmer. Entering politics, Carter was a successful peanut farmer in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, following his service in the U.S. Navy. He returned to farming after his father's death in 1953 to save the family farm from financial difficulties. But did you also know he was a naval nuclear engineer? Carter was trained as a nuclear engineer in the U.S. Navy under Admiral Hyman Rickover. He was part of a team that helped develop the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine program. Bet you didn't know that. First president born in a hospital. Jimmy Carter was the first U.S. president to be born in a hospital on October 1st, 1924 at Wise Sanitarium in Plains, Georgia. Jimmy Carter was a speed reader. Carter was a speed reader capable of reading several hundred words per minute. He has used this skill throughout his life to absorb large amounts of information quickly. He was the author of more than 30 books. Carter was a prolific author, having written over 30 books on a variety of topics, including politics, religion, human rights, and his personal life. His memoirs and reflections have won critical acclaim. He's the first president to live in public housing. As a child, Carter lived in public housing. His family moved into government-subsidized housing for workers in Plains, Georgia, when his father managed a farm. Amnesty for Vietnam veterans, draft evaders. On his first day in office, Carter granted amnesty to thousands of men who had evaded the draft during the Vietnam War, a highly controversial but principled decision aimed at national healing. That was kind of the beginning. I remember all of this, of what kind of man he really was, because he took on to do what he did in offering amnesty to those thousands of men who didn't go to the Vietnam War, especially in face of the fact that 10,000 or more men lost their lives in the Vietnam War. It kind of showed what kind of man he was. Skilled woodworker. Carter was an accomplished woodworker and carpenter. He often crafted furniture and even built some of the furniture in his own home. His woodworking skills align with his lifelong commitment to manual labor, especially through his work with Habitat for Humanity. Beekeeper. Carter took up beekeeping after leaving the White House. He tended to a number of hives on his property and advocated for environmental protection and bee conservation. Cancer survivor. In 2015, at the age of 90, Carter was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma that had spread to his brain and liver. Remarkably, after undergoing treatment, Carter announced later that year that he was cancer-free. Here are 10 unusual more facts about Jimmy Carter. Speed walker. Carter was known for his unusual hobby of speed walking. Even while president, he often walked at a fast pace for exercise, sometimes covering up to 3 miles in 45 minutes. First president to be sworn in using a nickname. Carter's full name is James Earl Carter Jr., but he was sworn in as president using his nickname Jimmy, which is rare for U.S. presidents who typically use their full legal names during inauguration. Unusual energy-saving measure. As a sign of his commitment to energy conservation, Carter famously installed solar panels on the White House in 1979, taught Sunday school during his presidency. While in office, Carter often taught Sunday school at his Baptist church in Plains, Georgia. This unusual activity for a sitting president reflects his deep religious faith and humble backgrounds. Sent a message to aliens. He had a sense of humor as well. First president to graduate from a public high school. Carter was the first U.S. president to graduate from a public high school. He attended Plains High School in Georgia, a relatively modest background compared to the private school education of many other presidents. 855-752-4842. This show, and I'm filling in for the one and only Maggie Daun. My name is Earl Ingram, is dedicated to the life and legacy of one Mr. Jimmy Carter.
About 40 seconds left.
Oh, okay. And let me say this. Expert fly fisherman. Carter was an expert fly fisherman and enjoyed the sport passionately. Navy reactor emergency response. In 1952, Carter helped disassemble and repair nuclear reactors that had partially melted down. More next on the Maggie Daun Show.
I'ma wade through your shallow love. Tell her deep I knew. I'm telling these tears going.
You're listening to Civic Media. You can tune into any of our live shows on any radio station across the state with the Civic Media app. Find us in your phone's app store and listen anytime, anywhere.
It's sad to think we're not gonna make it, and it's gotten to the point where we just can't fake it. Ooh, for some ungodly reason, we just won't let it die. I guess neither one of us.
All right, welcome back to the Maggie Daun Show. I'm Earl Ingram, sitting in for Maggie Daun, and I do a Motown Monday on my show. So if you're wondering what the music is and what it's going to be for this 2 hours, it's going to be Earl Ingram doing the Motown Monday on the Maggie Daun Show. So if you're just joining us, I have said that I am going to dedicate this entire show to the life and legacy of one Mr. Jimmy Carter. And I just got through reading some of the things. It's too numerous to talk about Jimmy Carter, but I do remember having read a book, one of his books, back in 2005, 2006, somewhere around there. It was called Our Endangered Values. Jimmy Carter was such a heartfelt man that even though he was considered, he wasn't a pauper by any stretch of the imagination, he could have lived a life of ease. The peanut farm was successful. And so he didn't have to live in that environment. But he did, because things and money did not define him. Service defined him. And let me just quickly, a couple passages from this book, and then we'll go to the phone lines. Our Endangered Values, America's Moral Crises. This he wrote in 2006. It's could be written today, because we still face these very same things that he was talking about then. In Our Endangered Values, Jimmy Carter offers a personal consideration of moral values, which for the most part, we struggle with in this nation. That's me adding that. As they relate to the important issues of the day, he puts forward a passionate defense of separation of church and state and a strong warning about where the country is headed as the lines between politics and rigid religious fundamentalism are blurred. He was so far ahead of the game, because today religious fundamentalism is infiltrated throughout this nation. And that separation of church and state that he warned about is here and causing and wreaking havoc because people didn't pay attention to him. Carter described his reaction to recent disturbing societal trends that involve both religious and political worlds as they increasingly intertwine and include some of the most crucial and controversial issues of the day. Many of these matters are under fierce debate. They include preemptive war, women's rights, terrorism, civil liberties, homosexuality, abortion, the death penalty, science and religion, environmental degradation, nuclear arsenals, America's global image, fundamentalism, and the melding of religion and politics. That's exactly what we've been fighting about this last election. It hasn't changed. He warned us about it. Let's go to the phone lines quickly. Mark from Prairie du Sac. Good morning to you. Good afternoon to you, Mark. How you doing, sir?
And I appreciate the Motown coming in, because when
Mark, you're on the air.
Back, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can remember the Motown. I can remember back in college, my college girlfriend, we danced frequently to Three Times a Lady by the Commodores.
Yes, sir.
That's something I always remember her when I hear that song. But I mean, I really appreciate the whole thing on, the fundamentalism that's creeping in. That what's ironic there is the reason those various faiths and denominations have been allowed to flourish in this country is simply because we have freedom of religion in this country and freedom from religion. Because if we were going under the rules prior to our revolution, we'd all still be paying tithes to the Church of England, for goodness sake. I mean that. And what annoys me even more is that the embrace of the Ayn Rand philosophy in a lot of these churches, that you're just supposed to be looking out for yourself and those who are just closest to you, rather than Jesus' admonition in Matthew 25, I think 25:31, that we're supposed to be taking care of each other. We're supposed to be clothing the naked. We're supposed to be feeding the hungry. We're supposed to be welcoming in the stranger. We're supposed to be taking care of those in our prisons. We're supposed to be providing shelter for one another. And that's the big admonition. They're not being, making sure you're heard when you're praying, because he warned against that, about the be not like the hypocrites. That philosophy is something even an atheist or agnostic can embrace. We're supposed to be looking after one another, just our fellow man. I mean,
well, Mark, the thing about Jimmy Carter is here's a man that became president of the United States and didn't compromise those views and those values.
First man I voted for president in 1976, when my first chance to vote for president was Jimmy Carter. I voted for him in 1982 because I thought Ronald Reagan was a scoundrel, and he, to put it mildly, that wonderful man, Jimmy Carter was a wonderful man through his whole life. I mean, he may have lusted in his heart.
Hey, Mark, we're certainly going to continue the conversation. The life and legacy of Jimmy Carter. I'm Earl Ingram, sitting in for Maggie Daun, the Dawn of Resistance. I'm happy that she gave me this opportunity. We're going to continue to talk about the legacy of this great man. Hopefully he'll never be forgotten on the Maggie Daun Show.
What I'm gonna do without you.
You're an organ donor, right? Well, here's a tragic fact. Approximately 20 people die each day waiting for precious donated organs. You could make a life-saving decision simply by getting that important dot on your driver's license. That little dot shows those who need to know that you've made a decision to donate organs at a critical time. Go to heroicdeed.com to learn more about the importance of organ donation and how you can make your wishes known. Talk to your family. Get the dot. Save lives. heroicdeed.com.
Yes, this is the ghetto. Showing up now.
All right, welcome back to the Maggie Daun Show. I'm Earl Ingram. I'm guest hosting for Maggie Daun, and listen, I do a thing every Monday called Motown Monday, so I brought my music with me. And I have dedicated this 2 hours to the life and legacy of a great man, former President Jimmy Carter. There's nowhere I'd rather be right now than having a chance to witness for one of the greatest servants that ever lived. That's who Jimmy Carter was. And so because people don't know, he doesn't get the credit that he deserves. He'll go down in history as not a great president. But you know what? We're going to cover some things that Jimmy Carter did as a president that many presidents wish they could have accomplished. He did some marvelous things as a president, even though he was criticized and ridiculed. In 1985, the Iran-Contra crisis will forever be, stamped on Jimmy Carter and, the hostages that were taken. And I never will forget, it's probably when I first, as a young man, really paid any attention to who Jimmy Carter was. And so there were hostages held by Iran. And American hostages. And the nation was wreaking just havoc on President Carter to do something, rescue the hostages. And he was receiving so much pressure from the right. And so instead of, he spent 3 nights, I'll never will forget this, in the White House, sleeping on the couch, trying to negotiate to get those hostages freed. And it wasn't going very well. You may remember this if you've been around as long as I have, but if you haven't, this is the story. And look it up for yourself. And he was pressed into a rescue attempt of those hostages in Iran. I never will forget it. And so the military devised a rescue plan, and former President Jimmy Carter agreed to it, and they sent a couple helicopters in the desert where, back in 1985, the technology certainly wasn't what it is today. And so 2 helicopters crashed with American soldiers who were part of the rescue mission. And Jimmy Carter cried for 24 hours. You may say, what a weak man, which is what the society said. He's too weak to be the president of the United States. But what they didn't see, and what Jimmy Carter had to say, was those men who lost their lives had families and loved ones and children. And it was one of the worst times in the history of his life. He wept. He wept for 24 hours because he was talked into that mission. It failed. But again, his weeping was because of the loss of life. Let me do this. Our phone line's open at 855-752-4842. I'm going to do this with or without you. I know the story, and I can talk about it for the next 24 hours because I know the quality of what that man was. Jimmy Carter led the clean-up maintenance crew that managed the nuclear meltdown in one of the experimental NRX reactors of the atomic energy of Canada. During the salvage exercise, he drew on all the years of experience he had with the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine program. Carter and the cleanup crew literally put their lives in harm's way as they tried to clean radioactive water that had flooded the reactor's basement. Carter was very apprehensive about the development of the neutron bomb during his presidency, owning to the horrific conditions he witnessed at Chalk River Laboratories Atomic Energy in Canada. Jimmy Carter was a champion of racial integration in schools in America. The passion of his was seen beginning around the 1950s when he encouraged his community to be more tolerant and accepting of racial integration. Following the U.S. Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, Carter lobbied very hard to get folks in Plains, Georgia, to accept the court's rulings. He used his position on the Sumter County School Board to propagate this message very effectively. As a member of the state of Georgia Senate between 1963 and 1967, Jimmy Carter was involved in a host of social and economic programs. For example, he served as the chairman of the West Central Georgia Planning and Development Commission, where he was responsible for distributing federal and state grants to a number of social initiatives. In his second term, he was briefly chairman of the Education Committee, where he successfully secured funding for 4-year programs at his alma mater, Georgia Southwestern College. Let's go to Tom. from Madison. Good morning to you. Good afternoon to you, Tom. I'm used to doing the morning show.
Hey,
so I'm
good afternoon.
Yes, sir. How are you?
I was just remembering Jimmy Carter is just such an amazing callback. It's kind of a slap in the face to wake you up to see just how horribly things have gone in the MAGA world. That we can even suggest having something like Trump as president when you compare it to men who had honor, who had
character.
Character, exactly. So thank you for doing this today, and please go on, because there are millions of people younger than us who have no idea about Jimmy Carter and have no idea what the presidency of the United States used to look like.
You know, Tom, I am going to continue this for the entire duration of the show, and it's nowhere near enough to talk about the accomplishments of this great man. Thank you very much for the call. Really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. En route to becoming the 76th governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter defeated Carl Sanders at the Democratic primary. He went on to defeat Republican George Wallace at the 1970 gubernatorial election. As governor, he was at the forefront of so many initiatives that tackled racial discrimination. Time magazine even featured him in a cover illustration describing him as the new face of the progressiveness in the South. Although very frustrating to the Georgia Senate, he earned the admiration of Georgians for refusing to partake in political favors and backslapping. He embarked on a restructuring program of the state government in order to reduce costs. He is credited with comprising over 300 state agencies into a little bit fewer than 30. Carter also promoted human rights in the state by establishing Georgia Human Rights Council to tackle issues such as police brutality and other prison reforms. Let's go to Dick from Madison. Good morning. Good afternoon to you, Dick. Long time no hear from.
Great show, Earl. Yeah, the integrity, the dignity, the honesty, everything about him. And then what we've morphed to now is just pathetic. Here's a guy, everything you brought up is immensely interesting. I mean, I'm the same age as you. I remember him when he went to 2 or 3 Mile Island. And with his background, you weren't going to pull the wool over his eyes. And I could see it, the look of the people that were touring or taking him through the plant. And if you would have morphed forward or moved forward another year and a half to Reagan, they could have told that man anything and he would have believed it. And by the way, too, the hostage thing was extended illegally by Reagan. And that's just so out of line what he did to keep that. And then they were released on Inauguration Day right after he was inaugurated.
You know, the contrast between that man and his time as the President of the United States and his morals. He is without question, I'll tell you, 2 men come to mind in my life that took the moral high ground more so than any others. That's Dr. Martin Luther King and Jimmy Carter. And people may say they may not mention Jimmy Carter, but that's because they don't know anything about Jimmy Carter. They don't know anything about the accomplishments of this man and what he did.
One other thing. Can you just imagine? He was ahead of his time. When
Absolutely.
You think about the things he was trying to do. Think where we'd be on climate change if we would have followed his lead.
Dick, he was brilliant.
He was already on that. Yeah, he was.
He was absolutely brilliant, and people laughed at him. And even today, they make mockery of him because they say, well, he wasn't very smart. He was one of the worst presidents we ever had. Well, that's because people don't know. And it's the reason that I'm going to take this time and go through part of the legacy of that great man. I'm not expecting to change the minds of people who don't know anything about him. If they can read, they certainly can find out because the information is there. I challenge those in this listening audience who condemn that man, who follow what they hear from Republican talking heads, to read for themselves and see that they won't find another president in the history of this nation that ever accomplished most of the things that Jimmy Carter did and was as a humanitarian. He was a humanitarian first and last. Hey, Dick, thank you very much for the call. As Georgia's governor, Jimmy Carter vetoed a very controversial plan by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to build a dam on the Flint River in Georgia. Riding on campaign themes of optimism, change, and equality, Carter secured a good win against incumbent President Gerald Ford in 1976 presidential election. The Ford administration struggled to shake up the fallout from the Watergate scandal of President Richard Nixon, hence providing a comfortable win for the Democrats. In his first few days in office, Carter issued a presidential pardon proclamation 4483 to all Vietnam War veterans. I told you about that. In a televised speech on April 18, 1977, President Jimmy Carter announced to the nation that there was an energy crisis. His speech was not to alarm people, but was intended to encourage the nation to use energy efficiency. He also called on major players in the industry to explore new technology and other forms of renewable energy. Carter hoped that all of these initiatives would instill a culture of energy conservation in the United States. That was in 1977. And Joe Biden and others tried to continue that, and yet it was dismissed. You tuned in to Earl Ingram, guest hosting for Maggie Daun on the Maggie Daun Show. We're going to keep riding this horse. 855-752-4842 is the number.
But don't you worry about a thing. Don't you worry about a thing.
You're listening to Civic Media. Find the latest news, information, and archives of all your favorite shows on the Civic Media website, civicmedia.us.
Welcome back to the Maggie Daun Show. I'm Earl Ingram, guest hosting for Maggie Daun. You can join us at 855-752-4842. Listen, it's Monday. I do a Motown Monday on my show from 8 to 10, Monday through Friday at 540 AM WAUK. So you can hear all those great, songs from Motown and back during my time. I'm talking about the life and legacy of one Mr. James Earl Carter Jr. You know him as the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Listen to some of these things. Jimmy Carter is credited with establishing the Department of Energy. I bet you didn't know that. Using the Department of Energy Organization Act in 1977. He signed the act on August 4th, 1977, as part of his efforts to arrest the U.S. energy crisis of the 1970s. The department was tasked with coming up with and implementing energy policies. His efforts were also complemented by the Carter Energy legislation, which was passed by Congress on October 15, 1978. The legislation lifted a number of regulations in the industry, including areas concerning the sale of natural gas, price control, and tax credits to consumers that use energy judiciously. Carter was instrumental in getting the Camp David Accords across the finish line, something that many presidents before him had attempted. But you won't hear people telling you about this. They'll give you all sorts of things. Well, he didn't agree with Israel. Wasn't true. But anyway, he was instrumental in getting the Camp David Accords across the finish line. The political agreement saw Middle East countries, Egypt and Israel, bury the hatchet after more than 3 decades of hostilities. The agreement, which was facilitated by Jimmy Carter, saw Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin meet up at the country retreat for the U.S. President Camp David. It remains unknown what negotiations took place during those 12 days in September 1978 at Camp David. However, Carter was able to convince the two leaders to sign the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in Washington, D.C. The treaty went a long way in diffusing the Arab-Israeli conflict in the region. Egypt thus became the first Arab state to accept Israel's statehood and its right to exist. A very monumental and prominent idea that Jimmy Carter was able to get done. Both leaders of Egypt and Israel, Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin, were awarded the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for the peace treaty brokered by Jimmy Carter at Camp David. President Carter dialogued with the Soviet Union in an effort to get both countries to halt nuclear testing for an agreed period of time. He was very particular about stopping nuclear tests done underground or in the air. Carter and his advisors struck a deal with the Soviets to demilitarize the Indian Ocean. On January 18, 1979, Carter and Soviet leaders Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the SALT II Treaty, that was then discontinued in the first term of Donald Trump. He just did away with SALT II Treaty, his first term. He established the Carter Center in 1982 to champion human rights across the globe. This nonprofit organization remains a very relevant body to this day, fighting for economic equality, social justice, and women's rights. It is the presence in over 100 countries where it often serves election observers. And so Jimmy Carter, his deregulation in the beer industry enabled people to home brew as they could buy materials needed. Prior to that, it was illegal to sell malt, yeast, and hops to home breweries. This created more jobs in the industry. Appointed by President Bill Clinton as peace broker during the North Korea peace talks of 1994, Carter had some negotiations with Kim Sung II. He was also involved in getting Alondra Gomes released from the North Korea in August 2010. In honor of his years of work in the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 that year. He had also campaigned very hard in hopes of halting the U.S. President George W. Bush's plan of going to war against Iraq. Over his very rich, fulfilling career, he had been bestowed upon several honorary degrees from universities across the world, accolades and medals for his tireless work in promoting freedom and human rights. This is really an honor and a privilege to talk about the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter. I'm Earl Ingram. I'm filling in for Maggie, guest hosting for Maggie Daun. We'll continue the conversation. A lot more to talk about. 855-752-4842.
The national news cycle never stops. but it can be hard to find news about your local community. Civic Media is dedicated to providing quality local and state news coverage across Wisconsin. With the Civic Media app, you can get notifications about local stories that matter to you and your community. Find the free Civic Media app in your phone's app store and choose notifications from the menu to tell us what kind of news you want to hear about.